The coroner's report described the decaying organs of a 70-year-old man, but the toe tag read just 43. He spent decades building an armor of muscle to look invincible to the world, yet he died a prisoner in his own skin, suffocated by the very pills he swallowed just to silence the screaming in his shattered spine. He took his final breath in a silent room while his 7-year-old son played with toys just a thin wall away, completely unaware that his superhero father had just run out of time. This is the tragic true story of Bryan Adams. Bryan Keith Adams was born on April 14, 1964, in Kona, Hawaii. From a very young age, it was apparent that Adams had won the genetic lottery. By the time he entered adolescence, he was already towering over his peers and teachers alike. He didn't just have height, he had structure. He possessed the kind of broad, dense, skeletal frame that strength coaches cannot teach. In the gym culture of the 70s and 80s, you were either a hard gainer or a natural. Adams was a natural. However, unlike many who find themselves blessed with overwhelming physical gifts, Adams was not a bully. Teachers and childhood friends recall a gentle giant demeanor. He was quiet, arguably shy, and displayed a level of reserve that was uncommon for someone who could physically dominate almost any room he walked into. He didn't seek the spotlight. He didn't crave attention. This personality trait, this innate desire to simply do his job and go home, would later put him at a disadvantage in the cutthroat, ego-driven world of professional wrestling, where politic is a verb and self-promotion is a survival skill. During his high school years at Kealakekei High School, Adams was a standout athlete, but he lacked the directionless aggression that often leads young men into trouble. He needed structure. He needed a system that made sense of his physical gifts. He found that system not in sports, but in the military. Upon graduating high school, while other athletic prospects were looking at college scholarships or drifting into local jobs, Adams enlisted in the United States Air Force. This decision speaks volumes about his psychological makeup. The Air Force is the most technical of the military branches, requiring not just physical fitness, but mental acuity and a strict adherence to procedure. Basic training stripped away any lingering teenage laziness. It instilled in Adams a chain of command mentality. In the military, you do not question the order, you execute it. You respect the rank, not necessarily the man. You endure discomfort because the mission requires it. This mental programming, the soldier's mindset, would become the defining characteristic of his wrestling career. Later in life, when promoters or veteran wrestlers told him to do something dangerous or physically compromising, Adams rarely pushed back. He was a soldier. He took the order. He was eventually stationed in Japan, a deployment that would radically alter the course of his life. At the time, being an American serviceman in Japan offered a unique window into a culture that revered discipline as much as the military did. Adams, standing nearly 6 feet 6 inches and weighing a lean, muscular 260 pounds, was a walking spectacle on the streets of Japan. He was impossible to ignore. In the mid-1980s, Japan was experiencing a golden age of professional wrestling. Unlike the carnival-style presentation in the United States, Japanese wrestling was presented as a legitimate sport covered by major newspapers, alongside baseball and sumo. The athletes were celebrities, but they were also viewed as modern-day warriors. It was inevitable that Adams would attract attention. The specifics of his discovery have varied in retelling, but the core truth remains. He was spotted because of his size. The Japanese promotion New Japan Pro Wrestling, led by the charismatic and visionary Antonio Inoki, was always on the hunt for Gaijin giants to serve as formidable opponents for their native stars. Adams looked the part of a movie monster, but he carried himself with the discipline of a serviceman. It was the perfect combination. When Adams began his transition from the Air Force to wrestling, he didn't just sign a contract and walk onto television. He entered the NJPW Dojo. Western fans often misunderstand the concept of a wrestling dojo in Japan. It is not a wrestling school in the American sense, where you pay a fee and attend classes 3 times a week. The NJPW Dojo is a live-in martial arts monastery. It is a Spartan existence designed to weed out those who lack fighting spirit. Adams entered this world as a young lion. The regimen was brutal. The day began at dawn. Trainees were expected to clean the facility spotless, scrubbing toilets, sweeping mats, cooking meals for the senior wrestlers. The physical training consisted of thousands of Hindu squats, hundreds of push-ups, and neck bridges held for agonizing durations to strengthen the cervical spine against impact. This training did 2 things to Bryan Adams. First, it forged a body of iron. Before he ever touched a weight for bodybuilding purposes, his tendons and ligaments were strengthened by calisthenics. At this stage, Adams was perhaps the healthiest he would ever be. He was completely clean. No steroids, no painkillers, no synthetic hormones. He was a machine running on youth, testosterone, and rice. Second, it reinforced his military conditioning. In the dojo, the hierarchy is absolute. If a senior wrestler tells you to do something, you do it. If they hit you during sparring, you thank them for the lesson. Adams thrived in this environment. He understood the language of respect. He didn't complain. He absorbed the punishment and asked for more. This earned him the respect of the Japanese veterans, including the legendary Antonio Inoki and Tatsumi Fujinami. They saw in Adams a good soldier, a reliable, tough foreigner who wouldn't embarrass the company. However, there was a flaw in this education. The Japanese style emphasized durability and taking hits to prove toughness. Adams learned how to take punishment, but he didn't necessarily learn the American art of protecting his body. He was taught that pain was a signal of a job well done. He was conditioning himself to ignore his body's warning lights, a habit that would later prove fatal. After his initial training and exposure in Japan, Adams needed a place to develop his character and learn the American style of working a crowd. He landed in the Pacific Northwest Wrestling Territory based in Portland, Oregon. Run by the legendary promoter Don Owen, PNW was one of the last bastions of the old-school territorial system. It was a smaller, grittier operation than the glitzy WWF in New York. The venues were smoky armories and bingo halls. The pay was modest. The travel was done in rental cars or personal vehicles, driving through the rain-soaked highways of Oregon and Washington. Adams debuted as the American Ninja. The gimmick was a nod to his time in Japan and the martial arts craze of the 80s. He wore a hood, utilized karate chops, and performed power moves that emphasized his height. To the fans in Portland, he was a sensation. He looked like a superhero compared to the doughy, rough-looking brawlers that populated the undercard. He was agile for his size, able to leap off the ropes and move with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible for a man of his dimensions. This period was the age of innocence for Bryan Adams. Reviewing footage from his PNW days, one is struck by his vitality. His skin is clear, his eyes are bright. He moves without hesitation. There is no knee brace, no back brace, no taping. He is a young athlete enjoying his prime. He was popular, eventually capturing the NWA Pacific Northwest Heavyweight Championship and the tag team titles. He was learning the trade, how to listen to a crowd, how to pace a match, how to conduct an interview. But beneath the success, the seeds of future destruction were being sown. In the territories, there were no doctors at ringside. If you tweaked a knee or strained a back, you iced it and drove to the next town. Adams, eager to please and maintain his spot as a top guy, wrestled through minor injuries. He utilized his immense strength to compensate for a lack of technical leverage. Instead of executing a suplex with proper technique, he would muscle his opponent up using sheer back strength. He was treating his body like a rental car, driving it hard with the assumption that it would last forever. He was working stiff, a term for wrestling that uses excessive physical force, because that's what he learned in Japan. He was hitting harder than he needed to and taking bumps harder than necessary. In PNW, he was a big fish in a small pond, but word travels fast in wrestling. In Stamford, Connecticut, Vince McMahon was looking for the next generation of giants to feed his expanding empire. He wanted men who looked like Bryan Adams. By late 1989, the writing was on the wall. Adams had outgrown the Pacific Northwest. He had the look, the size, and the basic training. He was a clean slate in the eyes of the major promotions, a piece of clay ready to be molded into a superstar. As he packed his bags to leave Oregon, Bryan Adams was arguably the perfect prospect. He was 25 years old. He had military discipline. He had Japanese toughness. He had American charisma. He had never failed a drug test because he wasn't on drugs. He had never been arrested. He was a dutiful husband and a hard worker. He was about to step onto the biggest stage in the World Wrestling Federation. He believed he was walking into a dream. He didn't realize he was stepping into a grinder that would demand a piece of his soul in exchange for the fame he was about to achieve. The American Ninja was leaving the dojo and entering the circus, and the circus had no safety net. The transition from the Pacific Northwest Territory to the World Wrestling Federation in 1990 was not merely a change of employer. It was an interdimensional shift. In Oregon, Bryan Adams was a big fish in a pond that smelled of stale beer and damp sawdust. He drove his own car, washed his own gear, and knew the first names of the fans in the front row. The WWF, by contrast, was an empire. Headquartered in the imposing Titan Towers in Stamford, Connecticut, Vince McMahon's organization was a corporate monolith that had ruthlessly swallowed the territorial system. By 1990, the WWF was a global touring machine, a television juggernaut, and a merchandising factory. It was the era of Hulkamania, where wrestlers were less like athletes and more like living, breathing, comic book intellectual property. When Adams received the call, he didn't hesitate. This was the summit. This was the payday. But as he walked through the doors of the WWF, the disciplined soldier from the Air Force was immediately confronted with a new, chaotic reality. He was no longer the American Ninja. He was a raw asset waiting to be branded. The timing of his arrival was serendipitous, yet fraught with pressure. The WWF had a problem. One of their most popular and dominant acts, the tag team Demolition, was in jeopardy. Demolition, comprising the gruff powerhouse acts and the intense muscle-bound smash, was a phenomenon. They were the WWF's answer to the Road Warriors, leather-clad, face-painted post-apocalyptic brawlers who walked through heavy metal entrance themes to decimate opponents. However, Bill Eadie, the veteran leader of the team, was suffering from a severe health crisis. An allergic reaction to shellfish during a tour in Japan had triggered a cascade of heart and respiratory issues. He could no longer handle the grueling schedule of a full-time performer. The WWF needed a solution. They didn't want to cancel the Demolition brand. It sold too many action figures. They needed a third man. They needed a clone. They looked at Bryan Adams. He was 6 feet 6 inches. He was 290 pounds. He was stoic. He was perfect. The rebranding was swift. Bryan Adams's identity was scrubbed. His hair was cut into the signature jagged mullet of the team. He was fitted for the studded black leather harness and the dominatrix-style mask. Most importantly, he was taught to paint his face. This ritual, the application of the silver and red grease paint, became a daily transformation. For Adams, it was a shield. When the paint was on, he wasn't the polite kid from Kona anymore. He was Crush. Debuting in the summer of 1990, the pressure on Adams was suffocating. He wasn't just joining a team, he was stepping into the shoes of a legend. Wrestling fans are notoriously tribal and resistant to change. When Adams appeared alongside Axe and Smash, utilizing the Freebird rule, the scrutiny was intense. Backstage, the locker room was a shark tank. This was the era of the old boys club. Veterans protected their spots with paranoia and aggression. If you were young, big, and new, you were a target. But Adams's background served him well. He kept his mouth shut. He carried the bags. He showed deference to Edie and Darso. In return, the two veterans took him under their wing. Barry Darso and Bill Eadie taught Adams the nuances of working giant. In the WWF, unlike Japan, it wasn't about how hard you could hit. It was about how big you could look. They taught him to slow down, to posture, to let the audience breathe. For a brief, shining moment, Adams was on top of the world. He was a WWF World Tag Team Champion almost immediately. He was performing in the largest arenas in North America: Madison Square Garden, the Sky Dome, the LA Sports Arena. The roar of 20,000 people reacting to his entrance theme was a drug more potent than anything he had experienced in the military. He was making six figures. He was famous. But physically, the demolition style was a grinder. The team worked a brawling style, which meant high impact. Every night, Adams was taking bumps on the hardened plywood rings of the WWF. The travel schedule was inhumane: 25 days on the road, 5 days at home. He was sleeping in rental cars, eating gas station food, and training in dungeon-like gyms at 2 a.m. The human body is not designed to be thrown onto wooden planks 300 times a year. By late 1990, the cracks were starting to form. Not bone cracks yet, but the micro-trauma was accumulating. The inflammation in the knees, the tightness in the lower back, the constant ringing in the ears. The demolition experiment with Adams ultimately had a shelf life. As Bill Eadie's health forced him into retirement, the magic of the trio faded. The WWF had brought in the actual Road Warriors, rendering demolition obsolete. At WrestleMania 7 in 1991, demolition lost to Genichiro Tenryu and Koji Kitao. It was a throwaway match. The writing was on the wall. The team was disbanded. For most wrestlers, this is the career death sentence. When a gimmick fails or runs its course, the performer is usually released. Adams was terrified. He had tasted the good life, and now he was staring at the unemployment line. He had a mortgage. He had bills. He had no transferable skills outside of the military and the ring. But Vince McMahon saw something in Adams. He saw the way women in the audience reacted to him. Beneath the face paint, Adams was undeniably handsome, a rugged, island-born good look that was marketable. McMahon didn't fire him. He told him to go home, grow his hair out, get a tan, and wait for the call. The hiatus in late 1991 and early 1992 was a crucial period of recovery for Adams, perhaps the last time he would ever truly rest. When he returned to television in mid-1992, the transformation was jarring. Gone was the black leather and the bondage masks. In its place was neon, bright yellow and purple tights, a deep bronze tan, a shaka sign. He was billed simply as Crush, but the fans dubbed him Kona Crush. The character was a babyface. He was presented as a laid-back Hawaiian surfer who just happened to be the strongest man in the world. To sell this, the WWF produced vignettes of him on the beaches of Hawaii looking like a Baywatch star. In the ring, his feat of strength was simple but effective. He would take a coconut and crush it into dust with his bare hands. It was campy, yes, but it worked. The fans loved him. He was safe for children, attractive to women, and credible to men because of his size. This period marked the zenith of Adams's popularity. He was placed in a prominent storyline with his real-life friend and mentor, Macho Man, Randy Savage. Savage, arguably the second biggest star in the history of the business, personally vouched for Adams. The two traveled together, trained together, and ate together. Under Savage's tutelage, Adams learned the psychology of the main event. Savage was a perfectionist, bordering on obsessive. He drilled into Adams the importance of intensity. "The eyes, brother. Use your eyes," Savage would scream. Adams, naturally reserved, had to learn to project a manic energy that didn't come naturally to him. But to maintain the physique required to stand next to Randy Savage and Hulk Hogan, the natural body of the Air Force recruit was no longer enough. This was the early 90s. The steroid trials were looming, but the aesthetic standard hadn't changed. You had to be huge. You had to be vascular. Adams, naturally big but prone to smoothness, had to work incredibly hard to maintain the shredded look of a superhero. The gym became a second job. The caloric intake was massive. The supplements were heavy. While the crowds cheered for Kona Crush, a silent disaster was unfolding inside his lumbar region. Wrestling is a unique form of trauma. Unlike football, where impact is often absorbed by pads or grass, wrestling impact is absorbed by the skeleton. Every time a wrestler performs a leg drop, they land on their tailbone. The force travels up the spine, compressing the discs between the vertebrae. Every time they take a suplex, they land flat on their back, the whiplash rattling the column. Adams was 6 feet 6 inches. The physics of a man that size falling to the mat are unforgiving. Gravity is a harsh mistress to giants. Throughout late 1992 and early 1993, Adams began to complain of back pain. Not the usual soreness that every wrestler lives with, but a sharp, electric pain that shot down his legs. It was sciatica, a sign that the discs in his lower back were bulging, pressing against the sensitive nerves that control the lower body. A sensible athlete in a sensible sport would stop. They would take 6 months off. They would do yoga. They would let the inflammation subside. But Bryan Adams was not in a sensible sport. He was in the WWF during a transitional depression. Business was down. Hulk Hogan was leaving. The roster was thin. Adams was one of the top good guys in the company. He had a prime spot on the card. He was chasing the Intercontinental title. The culture of the locker room was explicitly clear. You don't lose your spot. If you leave, someone else takes your paycheck. Someone else sells the action figures. So Adams did what the soldier does. He taped it up. He ignored it. He modified his movements, trying to land lighter, which is biomechanically impossible for a 300-pound man. He began to rely on over-the-counter anti-inflammatories, eating ibuprofen like candy, chewing holes in his stomach lining just to dull the fire in his back. The catastrophe didn't happen in a single cinematic explosion. It wasn't a folding chair shot that broke him. It was the accumulation of thousands of microfractures, finally giving way. During a routine match in 1993, while performing a standard move, Adams felt something go. It wasn't a pop, it was a collapse. It felt, as he later described to friends, like someone had poured boiling water into his hips. His legs went numb. The strength evaporated. He finished the match. Because that is the first law of wrestling, finish the match. He dragged his useless legs through the motions, hit the finish, and crawled to the back. The diagnosis was devastating. Several vertebrae in his lower back were effectively pulverized. The discs were gone. Bone was grinding on bone. The doctors told him that without surgery, he was looking at permanent nerve damage. He might lose the ability to walk properly, let alone wrestle. The procedure recommended was a spinal fusion. In 1993, this was heavy, invasive surgery. It involved slicing through the thick muscles of the back, removing the damaged disc material, and inserting bone grafts. Then the surgeon would screw titanium rods into the vertebrae to lock them in place, fusing the bones into a single solid column. The recovery time was supposed to be extensive. The spine loses its flexibility. The shock absorption is gone. For a normal person, it means a life of careful movement. For a professional wrestler, it should have been a retirement slip. Adams underwent the surgery. He lay in a hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, the anesthesia wearing off, replaced by the profound, deep ache of surgical trauma. This is the moment where the tragedy truly begins, not with the injury, but with the reaction to it. Lying in that bed, Adams wasn't thinking about his long-term health. He was thinking about the rent. He was thinking about his spot. He watched Monday Night Raw from his hospital room and saw other big men taking his airtime. He saw the next big thing warming up. The paranoia set in. The silence from the office was deafening. In the wrestling business, when you are useful, the phone never stops ringing. When you are broken, the silence is absolute. He needed to get back. He needed to prove he wasn't finished. The doctors told him to wait a year, maybe 18 months. Adams was back in the gym in 4 months. The return to training was a nightmare. His back, now stiffened by metal rods, didn't move the way it used to. Every squat was agony. Every jog on the treadmill sent shock waves through the hardware in his spine. To get through the physical therapy and to accelerate his return to the ring, Adams needed help. He couldn't just tough it out. The pain was biological, mechanical, and overwhelming. He was introduced to prescription opioids, Vicodin, Percocet. At first it was legitimate. It was a prescription. It was medicine. It took the edge off. It allowed him to sleep. It allowed him to put 300 pounds on the bar and squat. It made the impossible seem possible. But the brain is a treacherous organ. It learns quickly that the pill doesn't just stop the physical pain. It numbs the anxiety. It quiets the fear of losing the job. It makes the loneliness of the recovery feel manageable. When Bryan Adams returned to the World Wrestling Federation in late 1993, the landscape of the company was shifting beneath his feet. The bright, cartoonish optimism of the Hulk Hogan era was dying a slow, painful death. The audience was growing cynical. The cheers for the smiling, shaka-throwing Kona crush were becoming fainter, replaced by a restless desire for something edgier. Adams, acutely aware of his precarious position, knew he had to evolve. He couldn't just be the happy Hawaiian anymore. He needed depth. He needed conflict. Creative discussions with Vince McMahon led to a pivotal decision. Adams would turn heel. But this wouldn't be a generic bad guy turn. It would be personal. The storyline was crafted around a betrayal by his on-screen mentor and real-life friend, Randy Savage. The narrative was simple but effective. Adams blamed Savage for not visiting him enough while he was injured, accusing him of caring more about his broadcasting career than their friendship. It was a storyline that blurred the lines of reality, channeling Adams' own deep-seated insecurities and the loneliness he felt during his recovery. The transformation was striking. The bright yellow and orange gear was replaced by ominous purple and silver. He grew a goatee. He stopped smiling. The Kona crush who crushed coconuts for kids was dead. In his place was a brooding, angry giant who felt the world owed him something. This period produced some of the best in-ring work of Adams's career. The feud with Savage culminated in a Falls Count Anywhere match at WrestleMania 10 in Madison Square Garden. It was a brutal, chaotic brawl that spilled into the backstage area. For a man with a fused spine, the physicality was terrifying. Adams was thrown into walls, dropped onto concrete, and tangled in scaffolding. To the audience, he looked like a monster. He was moving with a new aggression, but backstage, the reality was grim. The bump card, the finite number of falls a wrestler can take in a lifetime, was filling up rapidly. The spinal fusion held, but the shock waves from the impact had to go somewhere. They traveled to his hips, his knees, and his neck. To maintain the intensity of this new villainous persona, and to mask the chronic pain that flared up every morning, the reliance on painkillers quietly escalated. It ceased to be about managing discomfort and began to drift into maintaining function. The pills were the oil that kept the rusted gears of his body turning. While Adams was battling his demons in the ring, a much larger storm was gathering over the entire industry. The United States federal government had launched a full-scale investigation into the distribution of anabolic steroids within the WWF. Dr. George Zahorian, a Pennsylvania urologist who had served as a ringside doctor, was convicted of illegally distributing steroids to wrestlers. The trail of evidence led straight to the top, Vince McMahon. The scrutiny was intense. The WWF implemented rigorous drug testing for the first time. The land of the giants was suddenly under siege. Wrestlers were shrinking before the audience's eyes as they cycled off the juice to pass the tests. Bryan Adams was caught in a bind. His entire livelihood depended on his look. He was a big man. If he shrank, he lost his aura. If he lost his aura, he lost his spot. He was faced with the classic wrestler's dilemma: follow the rules and risk your career, or break the rules and risk your freedom. Adams, who had built his life on the discipline of following orders, now found himself in a world where the unspoken order contradicted the written order. He chose the path of the outlaw. He continued to use. The hammer dropped on a sunny day in Hawaii. On March 13, 1995, Bryan Adams was at his home in Kona. He was 31 years old. He was a WWF superstar. He was a husband. He didn't hear the ring announcer. He heard the heavy knock of law enforcement. Officers from the Hawaii Police Department, acting on information regarding illegal shipments, executed a search warrant on his residence. It wasn't a simple knock and talk. It was a raid. They tore through the house, opening drawers, overturning mattresses, searching for the contraband that fueled the Crush persona. What they found was a veritable pharmacy. According to police reports and subsequent court documents, authorities seized a significant quantity of anabolic steroids. But that wasn't all. They found unregistered firearms, specifically semi-automatic handguns and a taser. The headlines the next day were devastating. WWF star arrested in drug raid. Crush charged with steroid possession. The image of Bryan Adams, the clean-cut Air Force veteran, the kid-friendly superhero, was shattered. He wasn't just a user. In the eyes of the law, the quantity suggested he might be involved in distribution. The timing could not have been worse. Vince McMahon was literally weeks away from standing trial in federal court for steroid distribution conspiracy. The WWF was in full panic mode, desperate to present an image of a clean, family-friendly company that had purged its bad elements. Bryan Adams became the perfect sacrificial lamb. When the news of the arrest reached Stamford, the decision was instantaneous. There was no meeting to discuss his tenure. There was no consideration for his loyalty or his broken back. He was fired immediately. The statement was cold and corporate. Bryan Adams was persona non grata. The company washed its hands of him, effectively saying, "We don't know this man. He does not represent us." The period following his arrest and firing was the darkest chasm of Adams's life. He was facing legitimate prison time. The legal system in Hawaii, while often laid back, takes gun and drug charges seriously. He eventually pleaded no contest. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation and fined. He avoided a long prison sentence, but he didn't avoid the cage. The cage was just different. Stripped of his income, his fame, and his purpose, Adams sat in his home in Hawaii, watching his bank account drain. The phone stopped ringing. The friends in the business, the guys who rode in his car, ate his food, and partied on his dime, vanished. This is where the psychological break happened. When you are a wrestler, your body is your tool. When that tool is taken away, you are left with the pain, but without the adrenaline to mask it. The spinal pain, which he had been suppressing with the roar of the crowd and the rush of performing, now came screaming to the forefront. Without the structure of the road, and with the shame of the arrest weighing on him, the relationship with Painkillers shifted from functional to recreational. He wasn't taking them to wrestle anymore. He was taking them to forget that he couldn't wrestle. He was taking them to numb the humiliation of being a 31-year-old washed-up ex-con. He watched the WWF on Monday nights. He saw the new generation, Shawn Michaels, Diesel, Razor Ramon. The business was moving on without him. He was a dinosaur, a relic of the steroid era that everyone wanted to forget. For over a year, Adams existed in this limbo. He worked odd jobs. He trained in local gyms, trying to keep the size on just in case. He was a ghost in his own hometown, the guy who used to be Crush. But the wrestling business is a cynical, amoral beast. It forgives nothing, but it forgets everything if there is money to be made. By late 1996, the WWF was getting battered in the ratings war by rival WCW. They needed talent. They needed bodies. They needed guys who looked tough. Vince McMahon, the same man who had fired Adams to save face, picked up the phone. He didn't care about the arrest anymore. In fact, in a twist of perverse genius, he saw the arrest as an asset. You've been to jail? You have a record? You own guns? Great, let's put that on TV. They didn't want Bryan Adams back. They wanted the convict. They wanted the man who had stared down the police. When the offer came, Adams should have said no. He should have focused on his health, on his probation, on rebuilding a normal life. But the lure of the lights is a sickness, and the need for money was real. He said yes. He packed his bags. But he wasn't bringing the neon tights. He was bringing his leather vest. He was bringing the darkness he had found during his exile. He was returning to the machine, but this time he wasn't going to pretend to be a hero. He was going to be exactly what they accused him of being, a criminal. The Disciples of Apocalypse era was about to begin, and it would blur the lines between reality and fiction until Adams himself could no longer tell the difference. In 1997, Adams was reintroduced as the leader of a faction called the Disciples of Apocalypse. The concept was simple, a biker gang, but the execution was strikingly authentic. Adams, along with his cousin Brian Clark and the Harris twins, rode actual Titan motorcycles to the ring. They wore their own clothes, leather cuts, jeans, boots. They didn't have stylized wrestling gear. They looked like the kind of guys you would cross the street to avoid outside a dive bar. This was shoot-style booking. The DOA was based on the real-life backstage camaraderie of these men. They really did ride bikes together. They really were tough guys who hung out in the back. And for Adams, the gimmick was a lifeline. He didn't have to act. He just had to be. The DOA was thrust into a gang war storyline against two other factions, the Nation of Domination and Los Boricuas. On paper, it was a chaotic, racially charged mess of a storyline. But in the arenas, it worked. The crowds ate it up. The sight of four massive bikers circling the ring on roaring Harleys was undeniably cool. Adams, sitting atop his bike, staring down the camera with cold, dead eyes, looked like the ultimate anti-hero. But there was a dark side to this reality-based character. By encouraging Adams to embrace his outlaw image, the WWF was implicitly validating the lifestyle that had nearly destroyed him. They were monetizing his trauma. His time in the legal system wasn't a shameful secret anymore. It was street cred. The DOA run required a different kind of physicality. The matches were rarely technical wrestling bouts. They were brawls, street fights, weapons matches. For a man with a fused spine, this was the worst possible environment. Technical wrestling, when done right, is a dance. It minimizes impact. Brawling, by its nature, is chaotic. It involves being thrown into steel steps, getting hit with trash cans, and taking bumps on concrete floors. Adams was a soldier, so he did what was asked. He took the chair shots. He took the falls on the arena floor. He rode the heavy motorcycle down narrow ramps, the vibration of the engine rattling his compromised vertebrae every single night. The pain management became a sophisticated, dark science. By 1997, Adams was no longer just taking pills. He was managing a chemical ecosystem. He needed stimulants to get up for the matches. Caffeine, ephedrine, whatever could cut through the lethargy. He needed opioids to dull the structural pain in his back and hips. And increasingly, he needed sedatives to come down. The wrestling schedule in 1997 was relentless. The Monday Night Wars meant that every week was a battle. There were no weeks off. If you were injured, you kept your mouth shut, because if you left, someone else would take your spot on the bike. There's a specific match from this era that highlights the danger. During a brawl with the Nation of Domination, Adams took a bad landing on his knee. You can see him wince, a flicker of genuine agony crossing his face before the tough guy mask slips back on. He limped through the rest of the tour. He didn't see a doctor. He just upped the dosage. In November 1997, the wrestling world was shaken by the Montreal Screwjob, the infamous double-crossing of Bret Hart by Vince McMahon. It was a moment that shattered the trust between the talent and the office. Adams was close to Bret Hart. He respected him. Seeing the company betray its most loyal champion confirmed what Adams already suspected. We are all just meat. They will use us until we are useless, and then they will throw us away. This realization hardened him. The loyalty he had felt to the WWF, the company that made him a star, evaporated. He began to look south towards Atlanta, where WCW was handing out guaranteed contracts with fewer dates and more money. Adams was 33 years old. His body felt 50. He knew he didn't have 10 years left. He needed to maximize his earnings now. In late 1997, Bryan Adams made the call. He gave his notice to the WWF. Unlike his firing in 1995, this was his choice, but it was a choice born of necessity. He wasn't leaving because he was creatively dissatisfied. He was leaving because he needed a pension plan. He needed the security that WCW's billionaire owner, Ted Turner, was offering. Vince McMahon was furious, but he couldn't stop it. Adams was a free agent. He packed his bags for the last time in a WWF locker room. He left behind the Crush name, the intellectual property belonged to McMahon. He was leaving as Bryan Adams. Adams arrived in WCW in early 1998, instantly inserting himself into the hottest angle in wrestling history, the New World Order. The NWO was the cool table, Hulk Hogan, Kevin Nash, Scott Hall. These were the guys making millions, flying private jets, and seemingly doing whatever they wanted. For Adams, joining the NWO was a validation. It was a signal that he was a made man in the industry. He wasn't just a mid-carder, he was running with the big dogs. But the culture of WCW was fundamentally different from the WWF. The WWF was a strict, fearful place under McMahon. WCW, under Eric Bischoff, was a chaotic frat house. There was less oversight, there was less discipline, and crucially, there was absolutely no drug policy enforcement. For a man struggling with addiction, WCW was the most dangerous place on earth. In the WWF, you hid your pills. In WCW, stories from the era suggest that the culture was far more permissive. Doctors were readily available to write prescriptions for pain management. The party atmosphere was pervasive. Adams, now making more money than he ever had in his life, found himself in an environment with zero guardrails. He bought a big house. He bought expensive cars. He was living the high life. But his body was deteriorating faster than ever. In the NWO, Adams was cast as an enforcer. His job wasn't to have 20-minute classic matches. His job was to stand in the background, look intimidating, and occasionally beat someone up. On the surface, this seemed like a lighter workload. He wrestled less frequently than he did in the WWF, but the type of wrestling was the problem. He was expected to be a monster. He had to perform power moves, choke slams, power bombs, military presses. These moves require immense spinal compression. Every time he lifted a 250-pound opponent over his head, his fused spine groaned under the weight. To maintain the mass required to look like an NWO enforcer, Adams continued his steroid regimen. He was massive during this period, arguably too big. His heart was working overtime to pump blood through that amount of muscle mass. His joints were crying out under the load and the sleeping pills. This is the era where the stories about Soma begin to surface. Soma is a muscle relaxer. In the wrestling world of the late 90s, it was known as the Holy Grail. It didn't just relax muscles. It provided a euphoria, a coma-like high that allowed wrestlers to completely check out from the pain and the stress. The Soma coma became a dark joke among the boys. But for Adams, it was becoming a nightly necessity. He wasn't taking them to get high. He was taking them to turn off the noise, to turn off the pain, to turn off the fear that his back was one bad bump away from snapping again. By 1999, Bryan Adams was a wealthy man. He was on global television every week. He was surrounded by legends, but he was a prisoner in his own body. He was trapped in a cycle of stimulants to wake up, steroids to look the part, painkillers to work, and sedatives to sleep. He was a chemical experiment held together by skin and leather, and he was about to meet the partner who would define his final act and perhaps, unknowingly, accompany him into the deepest waters of his addiction. World Championship Wrestling was a kingdom in flames in 1999. The company that had nearly driven the WWF out of business was now collapsing under the weight of its own ego, financial mismanagement, and backstage politics. The booking was erratic, changing by the hour. Legends were collecting massive paychecks to do nothing, while younger talent was suffocating in the mid-card. In this chaotic ecosystem, Bryan Adams was adrift. His run with the NWO Black and White, the B team, had relegated him to the background. He was an enforcer, a glorified bodyguard used to take bumps for the stars. He was earning a fantastic living, but his career momentum had stalled. He was just another big body in a locker room full of them. But amidst the wreckage of WCW's creative direction, Adams found a lifeline. It wasn't a storyline. It was a partnership. He reconnected with Brian Clark. Clark, known previously as Atom Bomb in the WWF and Wrath in WCW, was a mirror image of Adams. They were both giants. They both had the super heavyweight look that Vince McMahon loved. They both had military-style haircuts and tattoos. And, most tragically, they were both hurting. Clark, like Adams, had a history of injuries. They were two massive machines with high mileage. They bonded over their shared frustrations, being underutilized, being typecast, and dealing with the physical agony of being giants in a sport that was becoming increasingly fast-paced and high-risk. They decided to stop waiting for the writers to save them. They decided to save themselves. In April 2000, Adams and Clark officially debuted as a tag team. They called themselves Kronik. The name was a not-so-subtle nod to the marijuana culture that was pervasive in the locker room, but officially it stood for the chronic pain they inflicted on opponents. The aesthetic was pure millennium cool. Drawing inspiration from the blockbuster film The Matrix, they donned long black leather trench coats, dark sunglasses, and combat boots. They looked less like wrestlers and more like government assassins or futuristic bounty hunters. Their gimmick was simple but brilliant. They were mercenaries for hire. In the chaotic storytelling of WCW, where factions were constantly fighting, Kronik would offer their protection services to the highest bidder. If you paid them, they would destroy your enemy. It was the perfect role for Adams. He didn't have to cut long, emotional speeches. He just had to look cool, chew gum, and throw people around. For the first time since his early demolition days, he felt part of a unit. He wasn't alone out there. The in-ring style of Kronik was marketed as high impact. Their finishing move, also called high time, was a double choke slam where both men would grab an opponent by the throat and drive them into the canvas. It looked spectacular. It sounded devastating. The fans loved it. Kronik became two of the most popular stars in the dying days of WCW, winning the World Tag Team Championships twice. But the term high impact was a double-edged sword. To perform these power moves, Adams and Clark had to lift heavy men, often dead weight, over their heads night after night. For a man with a fused spine, the mechanics of a chokeslam are brutal. The compression on the vertebrae when planting your feet to lift 250 pounds is immense. Then comes the bump. Even when delivering a move, the attacker often drops to their knees or jars their back. Adams was destroying what was left of his structural integrity. As 2000 rolled into 2001, WCW was in a death spiral. Checks were bouncing, ratings were abysmal. The backstage atmosphere was funereal. Yet Kronik remained a bright spot. Adams and Clark were legitimate friends. They traveled together, ate together, and watched each other's backs in a locker room full of sharks. This brotherhood was vital for Adams. It gave him a sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself, he was fighting for Clark. But they both knew the end was coming. The rumors of a sale were swirling. In March 2001, the unthinkable happened. Vince McMahon bought WCW. The Great War was over. The WWF had won. For the vast majority of the WCW roster, this was the end of the line. But for Kronik, there was hope. They were big. They were popular. They had the WWF look. Surely Vince would want them. Adams and Clark sat out the initial months of the Invasion storyline, collecting their guaranteed money from their Time Warner contracts. They healed up, or tried to. In September 2001, the call finally came. The WWF wanted Kronik. They were brought in as hired guns for Steven Richards to target The Undertaker and Kane. On paper, it was a dream match. Four of the biggest men in the industry. Two legendary tag teams. It was scheduled for the Unforgiven pay-per-view on September 23, 2001. It would go down as one of the most disastrous nights in Bryan Adams' career. Several factors conspired to make the Unforgiven match a catastrophe. First, ring rust. Adams and Clark hadn't wrestled a competitive match in months. Second, the WWF style. The WWF ring was different. Harder, smaller, with tighter ropes. The pace was faster. Third, the politics. The Undertaker was the locker room leader and a staunch WWF loyalist. He viewed the incoming WCW talent with skepticism. He wasn't going to make it easy for them. The match was a mess. It was clunky, awkward, and poorly timed. There was a moment where Adams, visibly gassed and in pain, struggled to execute basic moves. The chemistry wasn't there. The crowd, sensing the awkwardness, turned on them. When the bell rang, Undertaker and Kane had won, but the real loss was backstage. Vince McMahon was reportedly furious. He saw the performance not as a bad night, but as an indictment of their ability. He felt they were slow, unsafe, and out of shape. The Undertaker, whose opinion carried the weight of law, was reportedly unimpressed. In the aftermath of Unforgiven, the WWF made a humiliating demand. They told Bryan Adams and Brian Clark, veterans with 15 years of experience, former World Tag Team Champions, men who had drawn money all over the globe, that they needed to go to developmental. They were ordered to report to the Heartland Wrestling Association in Cincinnati to refine their skills. It was a slap in the face. It was the equivalent of telling a senior surgeon to go back to medical school because he had one bad surgery. Brian Clark refused immediately. He walked away. Bryan Adams, ever the soldier, briefly considered it. He went down to HWA. He tried to be a good company man, but his body screamed no. The HWA was a training ground for rookies. It meant wrestling in high school gyms, taking bumps on terrible mats, and driving long hours for no money. Adams realized the absurdity of the situation. He was nearly 40 years old. He had a metal spine. He had achieved everything there was to achieve. Why was he breaking his body for a company that clearly didn't respect him? In November 2001, Bryan Adams made the decision. He refused to continue in developmental. The WWF released him. For the second time in his life, Adams was fired by the WWF. But this time, it felt final. There was no WCW to jump to. There was no Japan tour waiting. The landscape of professional wrestling had consolidated into a monopoly. If you weren't in the WWF, you weren't anywhere. The year 2001 ended with Bryan Adams sitting at home in Tampa. The adrenaline was gone. The roar of the crowd was gone. The camaraderie of the road, the laughter with Brian Clark, the shared struggle was gone. All that was left was the house he had bought with wrestling money, the family he had tried to support, and the crushing, relentless pain in his back. The identity crisis was immediate. Who is Bryan Adams if he isn't Crush? Who is he if he isn't a mercenary? He was a 37-year-old retired athlete with no other skills, a high cost of living, and a medical dependency on pharmaceuticals that was no longer supported by a team of doctors, but by a network of shady internet pharmacies and questionable clinics. He tried to look for a way out. He looked at the only other sport that paid for violence, boxing. It was a desperate Hail Mary pass. And as we will see, it was a decision that would prove that his body had not just quit on him, it had completely surrendered. The Kronik era was over. The era of survival had begun. By 2002, Bryan Adams was a man standing on the edge of a cliff, looking for a bridge that had already burned down. The wrestling world had closed its doors. The WWF had released him. WCW was a memory. Japan was physically impossible given the state of his spine, but the financial reality of his life remained. He was a 38-year-old man with a mortgage, a family, and a lifestyle built on a six-figure income that had suddenly evaporated. In a move that reeks of desperation and denial, Adams announced he was transitioning to professional boxing. On paper, it seemed like a joke, a professional wrestler, broken and battered, stepping into the ring for a shoot fight. But Adams was serious. He wasn't doing it for glory. He was doing it because it was the only other industry that paid men for their physical size and intimidation factor. He convinced himself that his hand speed was still there. He convinced himself that he could be a heavyweight attraction, a spectacle fighter who could draw a gate. The reality check was immediate and brutal. Adams entered a boxing gym in Florida, ready to reinvent himself. He taped his hands. He stepped into the ring to spar. And in his very first serious training session, his body issued its final veto. While throwing a combination, his shoulder, a joint that had absorbed thousands of clotheslines and slams over 15 years, completely gave out. It wasn't just a strain, it was a structural failure. The ligaments, worn down to threads, snapped. It was the universe screaming at him, stop. There would be no boxing career. There would be no big payday. The realization was crushing. Adams had to go home, ice his ruined shoulder, and accept the terrifying truth. He was done. In January 2003, nearly a year after his release from the WWF, Bryan Adams officially underwent surgery to repair his shoulder and treat the recurring issues in his fused spine. Following the procedure, the doctors gave him the news he already knew but dreaded hearing. He could never wrestle again. Retirement for a professional athlete is often described as a little death. For a wrestler, it is a complete erasure of self. For 15 years, Bryan Adams had been someone else. He had been a ninja, a demolition man, a Hawaiian superhero, a biker, a mercenary. He had lived his life in airports, hotels, and arenas. He was addicted to the adrenaline, the camaraderie, and the noise. Now, he was just Bryan. He was a civilian. He retreated to his home in Tampa, Florida. To the neighbors, he was the big, quiet guy who mowed his lawn and looked a bit stiff when he walked. They didn't know that every step he took was a negotiation with pain. Stripped of his own career, Adams found a strange half-life in the orbit of his old mentor, Randy Macho Man Savage. Savage was living in the Tampa area as well, semi-retired and increasingly reclusive. The relationship between the two was complex. Savage, known for his intense paranoia and erratic behavior, trusted almost no one. But he trusted Bryan Adams. Adams became Savage's de facto bodyguard, driver, and confidant. It was a role that suited Adams's personality. The loyal soldier, the silent enforcer. When Savage made public appearances or released his rap album, Adams was there in the background, arms crossed, watching the door. There is a tragic irony in this. Adams, a man who could barely bend over to tie his shoes due to his fused spine, was employed to protect one of the toughest men in history. It wasn't about physical protection, it was about emotional security. Adams was the only person who understood the language Savage spoke. They were two old war horses, survivors of a business that had chewed them up, finding comfort in their shared scars. But this proximity to Savage also kept Adams tethered to the past. He couldn't fully move on because his daily life was still consumed by wrestling stories, wrestling people, and wrestling memories. He was living in the echo of the arena, unable to find a new song to sing. His spinal fusion, performed in 1993, had stabilized his back, but at a terrible cost. The fused vertebrae meant that the force of gravity was not distributed evenly. The adjacent segments of his spine, the ones above and below the fusion, were taking double the load. By 2004 to 2005, his hips were degenerating. His knees were bone on bone. Chronic pain is not just a sensation, it is a disease of the nervous system. It rewires the brain. It causes depression, anxiety, and irritability. Adams was in a trap. He couldn't exercise intensely to manage his weight because of the pain. But as he became more sedentary, he gained weight, which put more pressure on his back, causing more pain. The only escape hatch was the bottle. The Soma-Coma days of WCW didn't end when the contracts expired. If anything, the usage became more dangerous because it was now unsupervised. In the locker room, there was a rudimentary form of peer review. If you were too messed up, someone would tell you. If you couldn't perform, you were sent home. At home in Tampa, there were no referees. There were no agents. Adams was dealing with legitimate blinding pain. He was prescribed heavy opioids, OxyContin, hydrocodone. These are powerful drugs that, over time, require higher doses to achieve the same relief. But opioids make you drowsy. They make you depressed. To counter that, he would take stimulants. To sleep at night, he would take muscle relaxers and benzodiazepines. He was practicing pharmaceutical alchemy on his own body. He was mixing uppers and downers, trying to find a perfect equilibrium where he didn't hurt but wasn't asleep. It is a tightrope walk that thousands of people die on every year. Friends and family noticed the changes. There were times he would nod off in mid-conversation. There were times his speech was slurred, but he was a master at hiding it. He was functional. He drove his son to school. He went to the grocery store. He maintained the facade of normalcy, even as his internal organs were struggling to process the toxic load. The most heartbreaking aspect of this period was Adams's struggle to find a new purpose. He wasn't an unintelligent man. He had interests, but he lacked the credentials to pivot into a corporate career. He dabbled in security work. He looked into personal training. He was a man without a country. He poured his remaining energy into fatherhood. By all accounts, he adored his son. He wanted to be the dad who played catch in the yard. But there were days when he physically couldn't get off the couch. The guilt of that, of being the broken dad, likely fueled the depression that fed the addiction. He watched as his contemporaries began to die. The mid-2000s was a graveyard for wrestlers. Mr. Perfect Curt Hennig died in 2003. The Big Boss Man died in 2004. Mike Awesome died in 2007. Adams went to the funerals. He saw the weeping widows. He heard the eulogies. He must have looked around the room and wondered, am I next? But addiction is a liar. It tells you that you are different. It tells you that you can handle it. It tells you that you just need one more pill to get through this bad week and then you'll taper off. Adams kept telling himself he was in control. But by 2006, the control was an illusion. He was a passenger in a vehicle careening towards a wall. As 2006 turned into 2007, Adams became more withdrawn. He was still young, only 42, but he moved like a man of 70. He had achieved the dream. He had been a champion. He had been on TV. He had made millions. But the transaction was complete. He had sold his body for that dream, and now he was living in the wreckage. The stage was set for the final tragedy. It wouldn't be a dramatic explosion. It wouldn't be a car crash. It would be a quiet, sunny afternoon in Florida, where the silence would finally overtake the noise. On the humid afternoon of August 13th, 2007, the silence in the Adams household in Tampa was deceptive. Brian, exhausted by a lifetime of battling a spine that felt like broken glass, simply lay down to rest. He told his 7-year-old son he was just taking a nap. It was not a dramatic exit. There was no final match, no roaring crowd. Inside his tired body, the chemical cocktail he relied on to function simply whispered to his lungs to stop working. The heart that had powered a giant slowed, faltered, and finally ceased. The true heartbreak of that Monday wasn't the death of a superstar. It was the quiet proximity of the tragedy. While Brian slipped away, his son played innocently in the very next room. separated from death by nothing more than a thin wall of drywall, believing his father was just sleeping. When his wife returned to find him unresponsive, the characters of Crush and the soldier had evaporated. All that remained on the bed was a 43-year-old husband and father who had absolutely nothing left to give. After 2 decades of selling his body by the pound, Bryan Adams finally received the one thing the business could never grant him: total, painless silence.